Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. This is a story of a broken violin, a deadly pact, and a woman caught in a web of manipulation and fear. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Violin That Wept Blood. The fog hung thick in the air, wrapping the streets of London in a pale, ghostly blanket. Each breath of the cold wind carried with it the scent of wet earth and burning coal, a familiar and almost comforting presence for those who lived in the city. The gas lamps flickered dimly, casting their weak light onto the cobblestone streets below, where the silhouettes of people moved with hurried steps, cloaked in shadow. Sherlock Holmes stepped out of the hansom cab with his usual quick precision, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the scene, noting every detail, the curve of the street ahead, the faint echo of hurried footsteps in the distance, the scent of pipe smoke drifting from an alleyway. His tall frame, draped in his well-worn coat, exuded an aura of quiet confidence, but there was a certain weight in his gaze today, as if the fog had not only descended upon the city, but upon his mind as well. "Holmes, are you certain about this?" Dr. Watson's voice broke through the silence. He stood beside him, the good doctor's brow furrowed as he adjusted his own coat, clearly more uncomfortable in the weather than his companion. "This case seems unusual." Holmes turned his head just slightly, his eyes gleaming with the sharpness that Dr. Watson had come to expect, though there was an underlying tension in the way he held his posture. "You are always cautious, Watson," Holmes remarked, his voice low and steady but carrying a note of something unreadable. "It is exactly what makes it intriguing." They began walking toward the front of a small town house, one that Holmes had only recently become aware of. The modest building was a stark contrast to the lavish estates of those the detective typically interacted with, yet the air surrounding it was thick with secrets. It was the residence of Viola Thorn, a violinist of some repute in the city. She had sent for Holmes urgently, though the message had been cryptic. "A strange occurrence. I fear for my life." Watson, ever the pragmatist, cast an uneasy glance at Holmes. "You know," he said almost hesitantly, "you are not as eager as usual. This case, it feels wrong, doesn't it?" Holmes paused before the door, his hand hovering for a moment before he knocked twice. The rhythm was measured, deliberate. It was, in its own way, part of the puzzle. "We shall see, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We shall see." The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a young woman with an air of quiet distress, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Her appearance matched the nervousness in her tone as she welcomed them in, ushering them quickly inside. "Mr. Holmes, thank you for coming. Please, come in." Holmes entered the small parlor, his mind already racing through the possibilities. The house was filled with the soft strains of music, though not from any living source. A violin, resting in a chair by the window, seemed to watch over the room, its polished wood gleaming faintly in the dim light. It was as if the room itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Tell me everything," Holmes said as he took his place near the fire, his sharp gaze never leaving Viola's trembling form. His voice was gentle yet firm, encouraging her to speak without pushing her too hard. Viola hesitated, her fingers playing with the edges of her shawl. "It's the violin, Mr. Holmes," she whispered, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "I've been hearing it. I don't know how to explain it. The sound, sometimes, when I am alone, comes from the violin itself. But I do not play it." Holmes watched her closely, his mind already calculating the possibilities. "You are afraid of the violin?" he asked, his voice calm but intense. Viola nodded, her lips trembling as she spoke. Yes, I am. And I fear that whoever gave it to me has returned." A chill ran through the room, one not caused by the cold. Holmes felt it too, a sense that the mystery was deeper than it appeared. Viola's story, though strange, wasn't entirely impossible. There were whispers in the city of debts paid in strange ways, and Holmes had heard rumors of individuals who would stop at nothing to collect what was owed to them. But it was the fear in her eyes, the edge of desperation in her voice that intrigued him. "Tell me about the man who gave it to you," Holmes pressed, his voice steady, though his mind was already racing ahead. "His name was Adrian Vance," Viola said, her eyes avoiding his. "He was a patron of sorts, a man with too much money and too many secrets. He gave me the violin after—" She faltered, and Holmes could see the reluctance in her eyes. "After we became close. But he disappeared, and I thought him gone for good." Holmes nodded slowly, his mind sifting through the details, trying to connect the dots. There was something important about this violin, something more than just a simple gift. But before he could ask further, the door to the room opened with a sudden force, and a man entered, a tall figure with a heavy gait. He was dressed in a dark, well-tailored coat, but his face was pale, his brow furrowed in evident frustration. "Viola," he snapped, his voice sharp, "you've gone and done it, haven't you? You've gone and brought him here." Viola recoiled, and Holmes rose to his feet, his eyes narrowing. The man who had entered was none other than Lord Thornton, a wealthy patron of the arts who had been a supporter of Viola's for some time. His presence in the room was a sudden jolt, throwing everything into question. Lord Thornton's gaze flicked briefly to Holmes, a mixture of disdain and calculation in his eyes. "I suppose you'll have your answers soon enough, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But be warned, some mysteries are better left unsolved." The tension in the room thickened, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken truths and veiled threats. Holmes stood still, his expression unreadable as he considered the new arrival. He knew then, with certainty, that the mystery before him was far from simple. There were far more secrets hiding in the shadows than Viola had let on. Holmes remained still, his gaze shifting from Lord Thornton to Viola, whose fragile composure seemed to crack under the weight of his presence. The tension in the room grew thicker, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, each moment adding a layer of unease to the already uneasy atmosphere. The fire crackled in the hearth, a distant sound that failed to offer comfort in the heavy silence. Lord Thornton's gaze lingered on Holmes for a moment longer before he turned to Viola with a harsh, almost accusing tone. "Viola," he said, his voice gruff, "you've made a grave mistake in summoning this man here. You have no idea what you've unleashed." Viola recoiled, the color draining from her face as if his words had struck her like a blow. She shook her head, her fingers trembling at her side. I had no choice," she whispered. "I had to. He must understand." Holmes, ever calm in the face of tension, allowed the silence to stretch for a beat longer. Then, his voice, crisp and measured, cut through the room. "What is it you think I need to understand, Miss Thorn? Lord Thornton seems to believe this situation is beyond remedy." Viola took a step toward Holmes, her eyes wide and earnest. "There are things about the violin, things I cannot explain, things that haunt me. Adrian Vance gave it to me, and now—" Her voice faltered, as though the words themselves were too dangerous to speak aloud. Lord Thornton, however, seemed less inclined to indulge her. "Enough of this nonsense, Viola," he interjected, his words sharp and dismissive. "You're not a child any more. You're a grown woman. These fantasies about the violin, about Vance, they are nothing more than distractions. Your obsession with that instrument is what's brought you to this state." The force of his words seemed to knock the breath from Viola, but she stood firm, her gaze hardening. "I am not mistaken," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "There is something in that violin, something wrong, and I will not let it destroy me." Holmes's sharp eyes darted from Viola to Lord Thornton, his mind already assessing the nuances of their relationship. There was more to this than met the eye, of that he was certain. Lord Thornton's dismissive tone, his irritation at being interrupted, spoke to a deeper involvement than he let on. The way his posture stiffened as Viola spoke, the barely concealed frustration in his eyes. It was as if he was trying to suppress a deeper emotion. "Perhaps," Holmes said, his voice cool, "there is something in the violin worth investigating. But I wonder, Lord Thornton, what role you might have played in this. You seem rather invested in dismissing Miss Thorn's fears." Lord Thornton met Holmes's gaze with a cold, calculating stare. "You assume too much, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I merely seek to protect her from her own delusions. This is nothing more than a case of an artist being overtaken by their imagination." The detective observed the slight twitch of Thornton's jaw, the subtle clenched fists hidden in the folds of his coat. Holmes allowed a small, knowing smile to play at the corner of his lips. "Of course, Lord Thornton," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 100 unspoken questions. "And what do you suppose is behind Miss Thorn's imagination?" Before Thornton could answer, a soft voice broke through the exchange. "Lord Thornton is correct, Mr. Holmes," said Eliza, the maid. She stood in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes shifting nervously between the two men. "Viola is just upset, that's all. She doesn't know what she's saying." Holmes turned to Eliza, his gaze never leaving her face. She stood rigid in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her nervousness was evident, her fingers twitching as if she were waiting for someone, to speak the words she could not. "Do you agree with Lord Thornton, Eliza?" Holmes asked, his voice gentle, probing. Eliza hesitated for a moment before nodding quickly. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. Viola's anxiety has only increased since her last encounter with Mr. Vance." She spoke the name as though it were a curse. Holmes studied her, noting the tension in her posture and the slight tremble in her voice. Something about her reaction seemed out of place. Eliza was not simply a maid. There was more to her than she let on. Perhaps she, too, had something to hide. "I see," Holmes said, his tone growing more introspective. "And what exactly did this encounter with Mr. Vance entail, Miss Thorn? Could you elaborate on the nature of your relationship with him?" Viola's eyes flicked to Eliza, and there was a brief, silent exchange between the two women before Viola finally answered. "Vance was more than a patron," she said slowly, her voice steady but low. "He was possessive. He wanted more than just my music." She shuddered slightly at the memory. "He wanted my soul." Holmes noted the way she said it, the weight in her words. It was a sentiment that could not have been easily fabricated. He could see that Viola's history with Adrian Vance went far beyond the simple exchange of a gift, and that there were darker elements to their relationship that she was only just beginning to reveal. Lord Thornton's lips twisted in a thin smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "That's enough, Viola," he said sharply. "You've been manipulated by a man with no scruples. Now stop with this nonsense and come to your senses." But Viola stood her ground, her gaze unyielding. "I will not be silent any longer, Thornton. I will find the truth, no matter what it costs." The air in the room had thickened, charged with something unspoken, something buried beneath the surface. Holmes could feel it now, an underlying tension that was as palpable as the fog outside, an unsettling sense that not all was as it appeared in the Thorn household. He took a deliberate step forward, narrowing his eyes as he glanced between the two women and Lord Thornton. "I believe," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying weight, "that the violin may hold the key to all of this, and I will uncover its secrets." The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire in the hearth and the distant rumble of carriage wheels on the cobblestones outside. The gas lamps flickered weakly in the mist that had settled over London, casting shadows that danced and swayed on the walls like ghostly figures. Inside the Thorn household, the tension had reached a palpable level, like a taut wire ready to snap. Holmes stood by the window, his back to the others, his sharp eyes scanning the street below. Dr. Watson, ever the loyal companion, paced restlessly, his steps echoing softly in the quiet room. The conversation with Viola, Lord Thornton and Eliza had left him with more questions than answers, and the weight of those unanswered questions pressed heavily on him. As the minutes stretched into an uncomfortable silence, the door to the parlour opened with a slow creak, and a servant stepped inside. His face was pale, his eyes wide with barely concealed panic. "Mr. Holmes, "There's something you must see," the servant said, his voice trembling. Holmes turned, his expression unreadable, and nodded. "Lead the way," he said, his voice carrying an air of calm authority that seemed to cut through the growing sense of unease. The servant, his hands shaking, led the way through the narrow hallways of the house. The atmosphere seemed to thicken with every step they took, the air heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. As they reached the music room, the servant hesitated at the door, his eyes darting nervously toward Holmes before he opened it. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows across the floor. But it was the scene within that took Holmes' breath away, though he gave no outward sign of it. Viola lay sprawled across the floor, her face pale and contorted in pain, one hand clutched tightly around the broken neck of her violin. The instrument was shattered, its delicate wood splintered into jagged pieces. Blood stained the floor, pooling around her, soaking into the plush carpet. It was clear she had not been playing. It was something else that had happened here, something far more sinister. Dr. Watson rushed forward, his medical instincts kicking in, but Holmes held him back with a subtle motion of his hand. His gaze remained fixed on the scene, his mind already piecing together the elements of what had occurred. "She's still alive?" Watson asked, his voice a mixture of concern and disbelief. Holmes nodded once, his eyes narrowing as he took in the details of the room. "Barely. But the question is, why was she found here in such a state, and what has happened to the violin?" Viola's eyes fluttered open at the sound of their voices, and for a brief moment she seemed to focus on Holmes, though her expression was one of confusion and terror. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to speak, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Vance," she croaked, her voice trembling with the weight of the name. "Vance?" Holmes repeated, his brow furrowing. He glanced at Watson, then back at the broken woman before him. "Did Vance do this to you?" Viola's lips trembled, and her eyes filled with something between fear and recognition. No, he's gone. He's dead." Holmes knelt beside her, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of struggle, any clues that might explain the violence of what had just unfolded. The violin, now broken and discarded, was the only thing that seemed out of place in the otherwise neat room. "Dead?" Watson asked, a frown creasing his forehead. "Then why does she speak of him as if he is here?" Holmes did not answer immediately, his mind working through the pieces of the puzzle. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the shattered pieces of the violin, the blood that stained the carpet, and the strange sense of stillness that hung in the air. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice quiet and filled with concern, "what do you think this means?" Holmes stood, his movements deliberate as he turned to face Watson. "I think, Watson, that the violin is more than just an instrument. It is a symbol, a key to something far darker than we anticipated." He glanced back at the broken instrument, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Someone is playing a dangerous game, and I intend to find out who." Viola's breathing was slow now, her body pale and limp. "The blood," she whispered. It calls." Holmes paused, his mind racing. The blood on the violin, the strange behavior of those around her, the mention of Vance, all of it pointed to something more sinister than a simple act of violence. He could feel the weight of it. The mystery was not just about what had happened here in this room. It was about what had been set into motion, long before he arrived. "I need to speak with the others," Holmes said, his voice quiet but firm. "I must know everything about the violin and its past. We have no time to waste." The faint glow of the gas lamps outside flickered dimly, casting long shadows that crept into the music room, where Viola still lay unconscious, her breath slow but steady. The broken violin lay discarded beside her, its shattered form mocking the serenity that once accompanied its music. Holmes, his face set in an expression of grim determination, moved silently around the room, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. His movements were deliberate, methodical, each step, each glance, a piece of the puzzle falling into place. Dr. Watson, after briefly attending to Viola, turned to Holmes, concern still evident on his features. "She will survive for now, but her condition is grave," he said quietly, his voice tinged with professional worry. "We need to act quickly. Whatever happened here, it is not something simple." Holmes glanced at Watson, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. "Indeed, Watson, this is no mere accident. Someone wanted Miss Thorn dead, but they failed. The question is, who and why?" He turned toward the shattered violin again, his mind racing. "The violin is the key, of course, but the circumstances surrounding it don't add up. It's as though whoever did this wanted her to feel trapped in a web." Watson followed his gaze to the broken instrument. "You're suggesting that the violin itself holds significance?" Holmes' eyes flicked back to the pieces of the violin on the floor. "It's more than just an instrument. The blood on it, the blood on her hands, it's too deliberate. The way it was placed beside her, it's almost as though it's a message." He bent closer to the violin, his fingers gently brushing over the splintered wood. "There's something deeper to this. We need to know everything about this violin's past, who gave it to her, who has touched it, and why it was so important." As Holmes examined the room, his attention shifted to the small desk near the window, where papers were scattered across the surface. He approached it carefully, his eyes flicking over each sheet with practiced precision. Some were musical scores, their notes neat and elegant. Others were letters, handwritten in a fine, flowing script. He picked up one of the letters, the paper crisp and fragile in his hand. It was addressed to Viola in the same ornate script. The sender's name was not immediately clear, but a single line in the middle of the page stood out. "The debt must be paid, and you know the price. You have been warned." Holmes paused, his mind working furiously. He had suspected there was something financial at play, but this letter, this direct reference to a debt, was something far more sinister than mere artistic rivalry. He placed the letter back carefully, his face unreadable. "Watson, have a look at this," Holmes said, motioning for his companion to come over. Watson took the letter, his brow furrowing as he read the brief, chilling message. "It sounds like a threat," Watson observed, his voice low. "Who would send something like this?" Holmes stood up and turned away from the desk, his mind already moving on. "Whoever sent it has a stake in Viola's life. This isn't just about a broken violin or a quarrel between lovers. Someone wants something from her, and they will stop at nothing to get it." As Watson continued to examine the letter, Holmes moved towards the window, his eyes scanning the street below. There was something in the way the house stood, isolated on this corner of the street, quiet and somber. Everything about it seemed to suggest that whatever lay inside had been carefully hidden from the outside world. Holmes' gaze returned to the violin, still lying motionless on the floor. The broken instrument was a symbol, a piece of a larger puzzle, one that had not only trapped Viola but was ensnaring everyone in her orbit. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice now low and filled with resolve, "we must learn everything we can about this violin and the people connected to it. There's more to Miss Thorn's story than we've been told." At that moment, a sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Holmes raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of curiosity and calculation. "Enter," he called, his tone steady but expectant. The door opened to reveal Eliza, the maid, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes darted nervously between Holmes and Watson, and there was a subtle shift in her posture as she entered the room. She held a small bundle of papers in her hands, tightly clutched to her chest as if they were fragile secrets. I found these," Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought they might be of use." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in her demeanor. She was clearly anxious, but there was something else there too, something she was hiding. The papers she held were old, their edges frayed, their ink faded but legible. Holmes took them from her with a quiet nod, his fingers brushing against hers for just a moment. As he unfolded the first page, his eyes skimmed over the writing. It was another letter. This one from Viola's patron, Adrian Vance. The words were impassioned, filled with a mixture of longing and threat. and they seemed to speak of a deal made long ago, a deal that Viola had no desire to fulfill. Holmes turned back to Eliza, his expression hardening slightly. "You've been holding on to these for some time, haven't you?" Eliza's eyes widened and she shifted uncomfortably. I didn't want to get involved. Miss Thorn asked me to keep them hidden. She feared what might happen if anyone found out about them." Holmes studied her carefully, his mind working quickly. "These letters tell a story, Eliza, and I believe they are only the beginning." The air in the room had thickened, and every word exchange seemed to carry weight. Holmes remained still, the papers from Eliza now laid out in front of him, while Watson continued to pace, his brow furrowed in thought. Viola, though still pale and frail from her ordeal, sat in a chair, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her eyes were fixed on the broken violin, now resting on the nearby table as though it were a relic of some long-forgotten tragedy. "Holmes," Watson said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence, "what do you make of all this? The letters, the violin? There's more to this than just a woman's obsession with an instrument, surely." Holmes looked up, his sharp gaze meeting Watson's. "It is precisely that, Watson, an obsession, but not hers alone." He paused for a moment, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the arm of his chair as he considered the next move. "I will speak with Lord Thornton and the others. They all have something to hide, something they've not yet revealed." Watson nodded, though his expression betrayed his concern. "And what of Eliza? She seems evasive." Holmes' lips tightened slightly, but he did not respond immediately. Instead, he stood, turning his attention once more to the room around him. The evening light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the furniture, stretching the room with an eerie quiet. The house felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. Without another word, Holmes gathered his coat and moved toward the door. "Come, Watson, let us begin by speaking to Lord Thornton. Perhaps he will finally tell us what he knows." The air outside had turned colder, the streets now dimly lit by the soft glow of the gas lamps as Holmes and Watson made their way toward the study of Lord Thornton. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the two men exchanged few words as they walked. Holmes' mind was already miles ahead, piecing together the scattered fragments of the case. Every word, every gesture had begun to form a pattern in his mind, a puzzle he was determined to solve. They arrived at Thornton's study, the door creaking open with an almost ominous sound. Lord Thornton, seated behind his grand desk, looked up as they entered, his expression as unreadable as ever. He gestured for them to sit, though his posture remained stiff, defensive. "I assume you've come to ask more questions," Thornton said, his voice cool but laced with the undertone of annoyance. "Viola's been through enough already. Must we drag this out any longer?" Holmes took a seat, his hands folded in front of him. "On the contrary, Lord Thornton, I believe we've only just begun," he said evenly. "We need answers, not only from Viola, but from those who have been closest to her, starting with you." Thornton's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Holmes allowed the silence to stretch, his gaze unwavering. Finally, Thornton spoke, though his words were laced with impatience. "I've already told you everything I know. I have no reason to keep anything from you." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Then perhaps you would care to explain why a letter from you to Miss Thorn, one concerning debts and the price to be paid, was found hidden in her room." Thornton's face paled for the briefest of moments before he composed himself. "You've no right to delve into my personal correspondence," he said, his voice sharp. "That letter was a private matter. None of this concerns you, Holmes." "But it does concern me, Lord Thornton," Holmes replied smoothly. "You see, everything in this room, the violin, the letters, the blood, it all points to one thing. You are hiding something, and I intend to find out what it is." For a long moment Thornton said nothing, his eyes narrowing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "I had hoped to avoid this," he muttered to himself before addressing Holmes. "Very well, Holmes. I'll tell you what you want to know, but first, you must understand one thing. Viola is fragile. She cannot bear the full truth. I was trying to protect her." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes glinting with curiosity. "Protect her from what, exactly?" Thornton hesitated, the words seemingly weighing heavily on him. "Viola, she doesn't know the full extent of her past. The man who gave her the violin, Adrian Vance, wasn't just a patron of the arts. He was part of a darker world, one of debts and transactions that go far beyond music. She was too young, too naive to understand what she was involved in." He paused, his gaze dropping to the desk. "I should have stopped her from getting involved, but He broke off, frustration etching lines on his face. "Why didn't you?" Watson interjected, his voice laced with disbelief. Thornton's eyes flashed, and for a brief moment a flicker of anger crossed his features. "Because I didn't realize how deep it went. By the time I understood, it was too late. Vance had already gotten what he wanted, her soul, her life, her future." Holmes narrowed his eyes, his mind racing. And what was that price? What was it that Vance demanded from her? Thornton's lips trembled as he spoke. "It wasn't money or property, not in the way you're thinking. It was the music itself. Vance demanded that she play his music, that she perform it night after night until she was consumed by it, until she became a part of it. And I couldn't stop him. I was too afraid of the power he held over her." The room fell silent, the weight of Thornton's confession hanging heavily in the air. Holmes stood up, his fingers lightly touching the edge of the desk as he processed the information. "A power play," he murmured, more to himself than to Thornton. "A game of control, disguised as love." Watson looked from Holmes to Thornton, his expression one of disbelief. "But how does this all tie to the violin?" Thornton's voice dropped to a whisper. "The violin? It was the instrument of her binding. The strings, the wood. It was all part of the pact. She was never meant to leave him, and now, with him gone, the consequences of breaking that pact have begun." Holmes' mind was already racing, putting the pieces together with unerring precision. And now, someone else wants the violin, someone who knows its true power. Thornton nodded grimly. "Yes, Holmes, someone is coming for it. And for her." The evening was slowly giving way to night, and the darkening sky outside reflected the mood inside the study. The air felt heavy, as though the very walls of Lord Thornton's grand but oppressive estate had begun to close in. Holmes, standing near the window, his profile framed by the dim light from the gas lamps below, seemed to be absorbed in thought, his brow furrowed. Watson sat across from him, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the table, restless with the weight of their conversation. Thornton had fallen silent after his confession, his gaze distant and troubled. Viola's situation had become clearer, but in many ways it was only more confusing. What had begun as a simple case of a woman's broken violin had unfolded into something far darker. Strings of manipulation, hidden debts, and a strange, almost supernatural connection to a past that seemed impossible to escape. "Holmes," Watson said, breaking the silence, "we can't ignore the fact that Thornton's story doesn't quite add up. There's something he's not telling us." Holmes turned, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as he regarded Watson. "I believe you're right, Watson. There is something off about Lord Thornton's account, but I don't think we're getting the full truth just yet. He has motives, and they go beyond concern for Miss Thorn's well-being." The fire crackled softly in the background as Watson leaned forward, his tone tinged with frustration. "What are you suggesting? That Thornton is lying?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved slowly around the room, his footsteps soft but purposeful on the polished wooden floor. His mind was working, moving through the puzzle pieces, searching for that one small hidden detail that would connect everything. "Lying? Perhaps not in the strictest sense," he said, his voice thoughtful, "but withholding crucial information. Most certainly. It's in the subtle contradictions of his words. His desperation to protect Miss Thorn is not entirely genuine. There is something else behind it." some deeper involvement. Thornton had been watching them, his face tense, eyes darting from Holmes to Watson. He had remained mostly silent, his pride clearly wounded by the detective's accusations. Finally he spoke, his voice low and almost bitter. "You're wrong, Holmes. You don't understand the weight of it all. She's been involved in things far beyond anything you or I could comprehend. You don't know Vance like I did." Holmes turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps I don't, Lord Thornton, but I know one thing. You are afraid, not of Vance's death, but of something else entirely. You're afraid of what Viola might know, or what she might reveal. And that, my dear lord, is what concerns me most." Thornton stiffened, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as if he were about to rise, but then something in his expression faltered. He hesitated. The facade cracked, and for just a moment something vulnerable, something human flashed across his face. It was quickly hidden, replaced by the coldness he had maintained throughout their conversation, but Holmes had seen it. It was the same fear that had briefly passed through Viola's eyes earlier. Holmes stepped closer, his voice steady, his tone now carrying a sense of urgency. "Tell me, Lord Thornton, what exactly did you owe Adrian Vance, and why is it that you alone seem to have the answers we're looking for?" Thornton opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as though struggling to find the right words. His eyes darted to the desk, to the violin, and then to the window, as if seeking some escape from the weight of the truth. Finally he spoke, his voice low and almost defeated. "It wasn't just a debt," he admitted, his gaze heavy with the burden of something unsaid. "It was a bargain. Vance had power, not just over Viola but over me too. I thought I could keep him at bay, protect her, but I was wrong. He owned us both in ways I never understood until it was too late." Watson, ever the skeptic, narrowed his eyes. "You sound as though you were forced into this, but you've never shown any signs of being manipulated. You're a man of wealth and influence. Surely, if this man was as dangerous as you say, you could have found a way to stop him." Thornton's laugh was hollow, lacking humor. "You think I could simply walk away from a man like Vance? He had ways of ensuring that anyone who tried to break free would suffer, physically, mentally, financially, and in the end, it wasn't just about money. It was about power, control." Holmes was silent for a moment, allowing Thornton's words to settle. The truth was now becoming clearer, but it was still incomplete. It seemed that everyone connected to this case, Viola, Thornton, and even Eliza, was bound by some unseen force. Each of them had a part to play in a much larger game. But what was the end game? And who was pulling the strings now that Vance was gone? Holmes glanced at Watson, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I believe there is more to Vance's power than we've been told. This wasn't just about Viola's talent. It was about her being used as a tool for something much darker. And the violin? It was the instrument of that control." Watson stood up, a new understanding dawning on him. "But why kill her then? Why harm her if she's so important?" Holmes turned toward the window, his eyes scanning the darkened street below. "Because, Watson, someone is still trying to make good on Vance's pact, and that someone will stop at nothing to claim what they believe is theirs." The silence in the study was oppressive, stretching on like a taut string waiting to snap. Holmes stood by the window, staring out at the dark streets of London below, his mind a whirl of thoughts, each thread connecting the pieces of the case. Watson stood by the desk, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, watching his friend with quiet concern. It was clear Holmes had begun to put everything together, but even he needed time to make sense of it all. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he thought, his fingers tapping against the windowsill, a steady rhythm of quiet contemplation. He was formulating a theory, one that had begun to take shape over the last few hours, but there was still one key question that eluded him: the violin. The broken violin that had been at the center of it all. It was no ordinary instrument, and whatever had transpired in this house, it was connected to that very object. "What do you think, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice soft but intense, as though he were inviting Watson to confirm a suspicion. "The blood, the strange behavior of the violin. It's all part of something, much larger than we have been led to believe." Watson met Holmes's gaze, his brow furrowed in thought. "You think this is all connected to the violin?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "But how? Why would something as simple as a violin be so significant?" Holmes turned to face Watson, his eyes sharp with the clarity of a man on the verge of solving a great mystery. "It's not just the violin, Watson. It's what it represents. The violin is a symbol of control, of manipulation. It's a tool, crafted in part by Vance, and now in the wake of his death, it's become the key to unlocking whatever pact he made with Viola." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. His voice dropped to a whisper, as though the very thought of what he was about to say was dangerous. "I believe the violin was more than just an instrument for Vance. It was a means of control, a way to bind Viola to him, to his will. She was never meant to be free, Watson, not until she fulfilled his wishes, until she paid the price for her talent." Watson blinked, his thoughts scrambling to catch up with Holmes' reasoning. "You're saying she was manipulated into this? Into using the violin for some sort of dark purpose?" Holmes nodded, his eyes never leaving Watson's face. "Yes, but there is something else, Watson. Vance's power wasn't only physical. It wasn't just about threats or intimidation. No, it was far more insidious than that. Vance made a deal with Viola, and she was forced to continue playing his music. A music that, over time, began to consume her, to erase her sense of self. Then why would she keep playing? Watson asked, his voice laced with confusion. If it was so damaging, why didn't she stop? Holmes glanced down at the broken violin, the splintered wood still gleaming faintly in the low light. Because, Watson, it's not that simple. The violin itself became a part of her. It was the one thing that tethered her to Vance's world. The more she played, the more she became trapped. It wasn't just her talent that was at stake, it was her very soul. The violin was the instrument of her binding. A cold shiver ran down Watson's spine as the full weight of Holmes's words settled in. "And now that Vance is dead," Watson said, his voice dropping low, "someone else is trying to claim the power he left behind." Holmes gave a single sharp nod. "Precisely. Whoever killed Viola tonight, whoever left her in this state, they are after the violin. They know what it represents, and they want to use it for themselves." There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth. Watson could feel the weight of the mystery pressing in on him, growing more complex with each revelation. But there was something else. Something Holmes wasn't saying outright. "And what of Thornton?" Watson asked carefully. "Where does he fit into all this? He seems to know more than he's letting on." Holmes turned toward the desk, his hands resting lightly on the edge. "Thornton is a man driven by fear, Watson, but fear alone does not explain his actions. He was involved with Vance, yes, but his relationship with Viola is more complicated than he's willing to admit. He may have tried to protect her, but in doing so, he played his own part in the twisted game that Vance set in motion." Watson frowned, his mind piecing together the puzzle. So, Thornton was protecting her from something, from someone. But it wasn't just the threat of Vance, it was the consequences of Viola's involvement in that pact. "Exactly," Holmes said, his eyes flashing with the thrill of solving the case. Thornton believed that by keeping Viola in the dark he could save her from the full horror of the bargain she had made. But in truth, he was only prolonging the inevitable. She was already caught in Vance's web. The more Holmes spoke, the clearer it became. The case had taken a dark turn, one that was as much about the psychological manipulation of a woman as it was about physical violence. The violin was not merely an instrument. It was a symbol of power, a tool for domination that had ensnared all who had come into contact with it. And now, The hunt for the violin had turned deadly. Holmes turned back to Watson, his expression resolute. "We must act quickly. Whoever is behind this is closing in. They will stop at nothing to claim what they believe is rightfully theirs." Watson's eyes narrowed. "And what now, Holmes?" "We find the violin," Holmes said, his voice steady with purpose, "and we uncover the truth of what happened to Adrian Vance. Only then will we understand who is truly behind this madness." The night had fallen completely, casting long, jagged shadows across the room as Holmes and Watson stood in the dimly lit drawing room of Viola's house. The fire in the hearth had begun to burn low, sending flickering light across the walls, but it was the tension in the room that was most palpable. Holmes was unusually quiet, his eyes fixed on the pieces of the broken violin lying across the table. The silence was broken only by the faint crackle of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. Viola was still unconscious in her room, but her condition had improved slightly, her life no longer in immediate danger. Yet the mystery surrounding her, and the dark force that had brought them here, had only deepened. Holmes had pieced together enough to form a theory, but now it was time to confront the one person he had not yet fully questioned. Eliza, the maid. Watson stood across the room, his eyes trained on the door. The air felt thick, charged with an unseen presence. He knew that whatever Holmes was about to reveal would change everything. His friend was never this focused unless he was on the verge of an epiphany. "It's time, Watson," Holmes finally said, his voice low but clear, as though he was speaking to himself more than to his companion. "We have reached the culmination of this case. The violin, the blood, the pact. Everything points to one person." Watson turned sharply toward Holmes, his brow furrowed in confusion. "You mean Eliza?" he asked, the name barely escaping his lips as if the very idea were too surreal to consider. "But why? She's just a maid." Holmes turned his piercing gaze toward Watson, his lips curving into a grim smile. "That, Watson, is exactly what makes her so dangerous. The very fact that she has been hidden in plain sight is the key to this entire mystery. Eliza is no mere maid. She is the true architect of the pact. Vance's accomplice, his agent. She was the one who ensured Viola continued to play, bound to the violin's power. Watson felt a chill run down his spine. The maid, the quiet figure who had scurried around the edges of their investigation, was the one responsible for the web of manipulation and control that had enveloped Violet. But she's been so docile, so compliant. Holmes nodded slowly, his voice growing more intense. "That's the nature of the control she wielded, Watson. Vance's influence on her, and through her on Viola, was subtle, insidious. Eliza's role was to guide Viola, to keep her playing, to keep her in line. She was never the vulnerable servant she appeared to be. She was Vance's shadow." The weight of Holmes' words sank deep into Watson's chest. He felt a sense of unease wash over him, a creeping realization that everything they thought they knew was about to change. The true villain had been under their noses the entire time. Holmes stepped forward, his voice now quiet but filled with determination. "We must confront her before she has the chance to act again. The violin's legacy is the key to her power. Whoever controls it controls Viola, and through her, the legacy of the pact Vance made." "The stakes are higher than ever." Watson nodded, his mind already shifting into action. The confrontation was inevitable. They would need to be careful. Eliza was no ordinary servant. Her role in this twisted game was far more important than anyone had realized, and now they were about to discover just how deeply she was entrenched in Vance's dark world. The sound of soft footsteps broke their concentration, and they turned to see Eliza standing in the doorway, her face pale but composed. She had been listening. "I knew you would come for me," she said, her voice calm, almost resigned. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet understanding of the situation at hand. "You've figured it out, haven't you, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes stepped toward her, his gaze unwavering. "We have," he said softly. But now it's time for you to explain yourself." Eliza's lips curved into a smile, but it wasn't one of warmth. It was something darker, knowing. "I suppose there's no point in hiding the truth any longer. Yes, I am the one who kept her playing. Yes, I ensured that she would never escape the pact she made with Adrian Vance." She looked down at her hands for a brief moment, as if contemplating her next words. "I thought I was helping her, protecting her. I never meant for it to go this far, but now I see there's no going back." Watson felt a sense of unease settle over him. "Why, Eliza? Why did you do it? Why tie her to this dark past?" Eliza's eyes flicked to the violin, still lying broken on the table. "Because she was chosen, Watson, and because I was chosen to guide her. Vance saw something in her, something powerful. She was meant to be his instrument, not just of music, but of something more. And when he died, the power he held was supposed to pass to her. But when she tried to escape," she paused, her voice faltering for a moment, "I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let her break free from what she was meant to be." Holmes stepped forward, his voice firm. "And now, Eliza, the consequences of your actions have caught up with you. You will not escape this. The violin has been broken, and with it, the power you've wielded." Eliza looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just end this? Vance's influence goes beyond the violin, Mr. Holmes. It goes beyond death. And I—" She stopped, her eyes narrowing, as though realizing something. "I made a terrible mistake." Before Holmes could respond, there was a sudden noise from the hallway, a loud crash, followed by a shuffling sound. They all turned toward the door, the tension in the room escalating. Was it too late? Had they waited too long? The sound of the crash had sent a ripple of anxiety through the room, the tense silence broken by the hurried steps in the hallway. Holmes, Watson, and Eliza turned toward the door, their eyes wide, as if they all knew that whatever was about to happen would change everything. Before any of them could act, the door flung open, revealing a figure standing in the doorway, framed by the dim light of the corridor. Viola, pale and fragile, stepped into the room, her eyes wide with fear. She was still recovering, her energy spent from the ordeal, but her presence was enough to send a shiver of tension through the group. "Viola," Holmes said, his voice gentle but firm as he moved to steady her, "you shouldn't be out of bed. You need rest." She shook her head weakly, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the door frame. I had to come," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I heard everything. Eliza, I remember now. Everything." The room seemed to hold its breath. Eliza's eyes narrowed as she stepped back, her posture stiffening, but she said nothing. She hadn't expected Viola to regain consciousness, let alone confront her with the truth. "Viola, you shouldn't," Eliza began, but her voice faltered when she saw the determination in Viola's eyes. "No," Viola said, her voice stronger now, a spark of clarity returning. "I remember everything. The violin, Adrian Vance's control, what he did to me, and what you did to me, Eliza." Her gaze locked onto the maid, filled with both fear and anger. "You kept me trapped. I thought it was love. I thought it was my choice. But I was a prisoner. You were never my friend. You were his instrument, just like the violin." There was no more hiding, no more room for the facade Eliza had so carefully crafted. The walls of the house, once so thick and full of secrets, seemed to collapse in on themselves. Eliza's face twisted into something close to regret, but there was no remorse in her eyes. Instead, there was only a flicker of something darker, something almost resigned. "You have no idea what you're saying," Eliza hissed, her voice tight with the strain of holding back her emotions. "You never understood what Vance's influence truly was. You were meant for greatness. He saw that in you, and I—" "You're lying," Viola cried, her voice breaking as the flood of emotion overwhelmed her. "You manipulated me into becoming someone I never wanted to be. You kept me in chains." Eliza stepped forward, her gaze flicking from Viola to Holmes and then to Watson, but there was a certain calmness in her now. "You think you're free, but you're wrong," she said softly. "Vance is dead, but his influence remains. You may have escaped his grasp, but you can never escape the legacy he left behind." "The violin," she paused, glancing at the broken pieces on the table. "It's still part of you. You can't break away from it." Holmes' voice cut through the air, firm and commanding. "Enough, Eliza. Your games are over. The violin may have been a tool for manipulation, but it no longer has power over Miss Thorn. And as for you—" Holmes's gaze grew cold. "Your part in this is finished." For a moment it seemed as if Eliza might resist. Her lips trembled, her eyes flicking toward the door, as though considering an escape. But then something shifted in her expression. It was as though the weight of everything, the lies, the manipulation, the years of control, finally caught up with her. She slumped slightly, her shoulders sagging in defeat. "I didn't want to do this," Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know any other way." Holmes shook his head, his eyes dark with understanding but devoid of sympathy. "You chose this path, Eliza. Now you will face the consequences." At that, Viola took a hesitant step forward, her eyes never leaving Eliza's face. "I was blinded by fear and by the violin," she said softly, her voice laced with sorrow. "But now I see. I see everything." The tension in the room began to lift, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from their collective shoulders. Viola turned toward Holmes, her gaze softening, though there was still a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with a new sense of determination. Holmes regarded her carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Now, Miss Thorn, you begin again. The violin's power has been broken, and with it the chains that held you. The path forward will not be easy, but it is yours to walk." Viola nodded slowly, her breath steadying as she looked down at the shattered violin on the table. "I'm free," she whispered to herself, as if testing the words for the first time. Watson, ever the pragmatic observer, finally spoke. "And as for Eliza?" he asked, his gaze turning toward the maid. Holmes turned to Eliza, his face hardening. "She will answer for her role in this. The authorities will handle her and she will face justice." The sound of footsteps from the hallway interrupted them, and a group of uniformed officers appeared, led by one of the local constables. The scene was coming to an end, but the aftermath was far from over. Holmes exchanged a brief nod with the constable, signaling that they were now in control of the situation. As the officers moved to arrest Eliza, her gaze lingered on Viola for a final moment. But there was no apology, no plea for mercy. Her fate had been sealed by her own actions. Viola watched as Eliza was led away, her expression a mixture of relief and sorrow. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark. Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance, their work here nearly done. "It's over," Watson said softly. Holmes looked out the window, where the city seemed to breathe in a quieter rhythm, as if the shadows had finally lifted. "For now, Watson," Holmes said, his voice filled with the weight of the case. "But mysteries are never truly finished. They simply wait for the next one." As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Holmes knew that the puzzle of Viola Thorn had been solved. But the world beyond this house still held countless mysteries, some more dangerous than others, and he would be there waiting for the next enigma to unfold.